and what we hope will be the beginnings of a greater dialogue between Berlin and London. The event has been organized around the presence of Dr. Hans Stimmann and his colleague Birgit Kaltenhörner. Okay, lovely. And Dr. Stimmann is the director of the Senate Department of Building and Housing in Berlin and responsible for the immense task of reuniting the city. And the Architectural Association, where we are today, is no stranger to the dialogue or to Berlin. And the Urban Design Group would like to thank Alan Balfour, the director of the AA, for hosting this event and for agreeing to take part. The idea is that throughout the day there will be a series of briefings and presentations about London and its comparison to Berlin. These presentations will be responded to by Hans Stimmann with more substantial dialogue and discussions at key points in the day, even perhaps some counter-presentations, I don't know. So, first of all, some domestic arrangements. The bar is upstairs. Coffee is there, tea, snacks, lunch, etc. will be available. It's pay for yourself, I'm afraid. Whatever you want, you pay for. You'll have to find out where the loos are. I think they're just downstairs in the basement. And the reception this evening is in the front members' room, just above here, and we have to thank Terry Farrell and Company for hosting that. So, on to the event. The first presentations are really setting the scene both for London and Berlin, and the idea is to provide the strategic overview of both Berlin initially with Dr. Hans Stimmann giving his presentation, then Alan Balfour presenting a comparison as a sort of international nomad, I might say. And then Rob Scott, I think, talking about the major strategic problem that we have in London, and maybe there are lessons to be learnt from and about Berlin. Okay, Hans Stimmann.
This is here in order, yeah. Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, I'll give you some small information. I need some lighting here near the microphone. I'll give you some general information, and in the main part of my short take is show you some slides about the central of Berlin. First, I'm not the planning director of Berlin. I'm working in the building administration. We have two big administrations, one planning administration, one building administration, and me, I'm Senatsbaudirektor of the building administration. We build houses and tubes and streets and theaters, museums, etc. First, the situation in Berlin now. Schinkel once said, one is only truly alive when one is creating something new. In that sense, Berlin is indeed one of the liveliest cities in Europe. The tasks at hand are especially complicated in the former eastern part of the city, including the historic center of Berlin. What must be done here has never been attempted before. The underlying objective of all building work is the reconstruction of a capitalist economy in a nationalized city of over 1 million people. The central element in this reverse revolution is the reintroduction of private ownership of housing and land. An integral part of this is the return of the economically responsible client, new German investor, and of the architects responsible to their clients. The Bundestag decision of June 1991 to transfer the German capital to Berlin means it also necessary to redevelop the historical center between Alexanderplatz and the Potsdamer Platz and between Oranienburger Straße and Kochstraße. An area small in size but important for the future of the metropolis Berlin. The stated objective is to carry out the economic, urban and architectural renewal of the historic center of Berlin without any further structural destruction. The further goal is to prepare Berlin for the Olympic Games in the year 2000, according to the principle suitable for Olympia and compatible with the city. Furthermore, the existing residential, commercial and industrial structure, depressing relics of the DDR's system, need to be reconditioned. Towards to the end, the following will be designed and constructed over the next few years. That's Berlin. Something wrong? Doesn't work, yeah. Over 10 million square meter of office space in office building, which is to serve as a basis for an economy with its promising future. New ministerial buildings and offices buildings, approximately 1.5 million square meters for the government and the parliament. Modern structures for sports, the construction of 3 new main rail stations. On the right slide you see the design from the Hamburger architect from Gerkan for the so-called Lehrter Bahnhof, and this is the first prize from the competition from the Parliament Center from Axel Schultes. The modernization and partial reopening of the Syrup S-Bahn and the careful renovation, approximately 170,000 residential units, including approximately 50,000 units built in the Eastern District before 1918. These two examples from the what we have to do. One typical building from East Berlin, and it's a part of the new suburbs in the east part of Berlin. It's a design from Charles Moore from California. It's very possible that crucial errors will be committed during the new Gründerzeit by the responsible Berlin Senate authorities, the private firms that are involved, and also by the city planners and the architects. The likelihood of such errors appears especially strong when one considers that the fact that the conceptual and planning guidelines for such a unique task are all but not existent. As the two halves of Berlin were unified, the East Berlin master construction plan was not adopted, as the land utilization plan for the 11 new Berlin boroughs. In addition, there were no planning documents which could have been confirmed as development plan. For this city of over 1 million people embarking on construction program resembling that of the Gründerzeit, there is no existing plan of zoning plan quality. So it's an absolute unique situation. Thus, the local community doesn't have the usual set of legal planning instruments with which it normally faces private investors as an equal partner. A city without legally binding plans has a special need for a strong model which are as ambiguous as possible. For all projects in the historical city, our model is the concept of the critical reconstruction, which was tested in Sasan Friedrichstadt during the International Building Exhibition in 10 years ago. The critical reconstruction of the Dorotheenstadt and Friedrichstadt must begin by calling to mind the widely forgotten fact that this historic part of the city was not destroyed by the war. Right slide with the red colored spaces. Here is Sasan Friedrichstadt. All red colored spaces mean private investment projects. These gray colored spaces are the area where for the German ministry, for the Hauptstadt planning. That's very bad to see, but this clear from the whole Berlin inner city. This is the Potsdamer Platz, Friedrichstadt. Next, please. Why? What is the reason for this special idea from critical reconstruction of the Southern Friedrichstadt? This slide shows you the Southern Friedrichstadt in 1929. It's a German capital, not destroyed from the Second World War. This is the Leipziger Platz with the big warehouses, stores, etc. The Wilhelmstraße, this is the street with all these government buildings. This is Hitler's Reichskanzlei. This is the Reichsluftfahrtsministerium from Göring, still existing as a building for the Treuhandanstalt in Berlin. This is the Spittelmarkt. This is the Meerenplatz. The other slide, the same situation in actual situation. You see, it's totally destroyed from, but you have here some. You see some rests of the structure of the city. And the normal, when you meet Berlin politicians or architects, they talk to you that the destroying of this city is organized by the Second World War. Next slide, please. And that's the lie. The city is not destroyed from the Second World War, from the bombs, from the Soviets or the Allies. It's destroyed from the planners and destroyed from the political ideas. And therefore, I show you two pictures from the situation after the Second World War. This is the Reichskanzlei from Hitler. This is the Leipziger Platz. This is the Potsdamer Platz. Das ist die Prinz Albrecht-Straße. Prinz Albrecht College headquarters of the SS. That is the British part. That's the photo from the same situation. You see, the structure is still existing. The buildings are still existing. They are only destroyed, the roofs, etc. But theoretically, it was necessary to rebuild this building. Next, please. The idea, the main reasons for the destroying were the ideas from the planners. And the first planner of Berlin was Hans Scharoun. He's the architect of the Philharmonie in Berlin. The first plan was so-called Kollektivplan. It was a group of architects and planners in Berlin before the DDR was founded. And his idea was a completely new city without the historical structure. This is the inner city, the Straße unter den Linden with the Brandenburg Gate, etc. And the rest is totally new. Free landscape, motorways, and the river Spree River. That was his idea from the new city. It was totally against the existing structure and totally against the whole historic structure of Berlin. And not only in the time of 1945 and 1946, also in the time of 1948, in the late 50s, they had the same ideas. And this slide shows two plans from a competition organized in 1958 from the former Mayor Willy Brandt. At that time, the first prize is Mr. Spengelin from Hanover, and the second prize is Hans Scharoun from Berlin. And his idea was something overtaken from this idea, from his old idea in this structure plan. This is the Sassenmeeringplatz. It's die Friedrichstraße, Straße unter den Linden. And the structure is totally destroyed. There's a big motorway around the old city and a park landscape. And the southern part of the Friedrichstadt was realized from the old Scharoun plan. This is the historical structure, and this is the structure organized from the ideas from Hans Scharoun. Circle place, and in the north of the place it should be a motorway. Next, please. So we go back to the historical structure. And first, we look to the structure. What was the main destroying point? And it shows it to the left to this slide. The red-colored streets are the streets where the main destroying points are fixed. There are very less points, but it looks very small, but the effect is very huge. And this is the existing structure with the houses and this historical structure in yellow. So you can see what is the relationship between the old structure and the existing structure. Next, please. But at least this is our plan to go back to the historical structure. Our idea is to reorganize the historical streets. For instance, the Spittelmarkt, this is the Leipziger Straße, with the block from the DDR time. We try to bring back, for instance, the corner on the intersection of Leipziger Straße by the Linden with Friedrichstraße. It's a very famous point. I give you some special pictures. And the checkpoint Charlie somewhere here. Yeah, it's the former border area. So that's the plan, critical reconstruction plan from the building administration, and every investor project has to is part of our idea to bring back the historical structure. Not only the structure. The next slide. It's some other very simple sounding ideas. Our first idea is to bring back the houses into the structure. And this is a typical situation from the Friedrichstadt. You have houses, private houses, one private house, second private house, third private house. It sounds very crazy, but if you talk to private investors now, they are not interested in build houses. They are interested in building big structures. So we have to learn, if you talk to a child, bring back the basic ideas from town planning back to the people in the city and back to the investors and back to the architects. So that's our main idea is to bring the house back in the city, and the biggest house is one block in the Friedrichstraße. And the house has some typical elements. The height is up to 22 meters. That's the last period from the 19th century, beginning 20th century, 22 meters line, and some typical elements from the Friedrichstadt are it's a very stoned area. It's not mainly glass and steel. It's so-called Steinerne Stadt in German words, and the element of facade is very clear. Normally we have one or one and a half or two sections in the ground, in the middle section, and the roof section. Next, please. So these are some elements of the typical Friedrichstadt architecture, and we will bring not the architecture from for the Friedrichstadt. I prefer modern architect, but we will bring back the structure of the houses to the Friedrichstadt. And so we discussed with architects from all over the world, from England and the United States, from Japan, Berlin, Hamburg, etc., France, with these elements of the architecture in the Friedrichstadt. Next, please. So I begin with some examples. The first big project, was the so-called Friedrichstadt Passagen, the Friedrichstraße, Gendarmenmarkt, Schauspielhaus von Schinkel, and these three blocks. There was a competition with international investors, and as a result, next please. This was the former situation planned from the DDR. The idea to build three blocks with connection between the three blocks. Therefore, they call it Friedrichstadt Passagen. That was a situation in the moment of Berlin comes together in 1989, and was broken down from the private investors, and they built their new houses. So we had organized a competition, and we have three architects with three private investors. First architect is Jean Nouvel, the second architect is Paikop, the third architect is Oswald Matthias Ungers from Köln. So one France, one from America, one from German, tries to interpret this our ideas from the new architecture within the old city. Next, please. That is on the right side was the plan from Jean Nouvel. That is Ungers, and that is Paikop. Next, please. That is the actual situation. The structure from the DDR was destroyed, and they started their investment 5 months ago, and that's the actual situation. And that is the model, the actual model in scale of 1.500. Next, please. That is the Friedrichstraße, the Bahnhof Friedrichstraße, railway station Friedrichstraße, and the streets under the Linden, somewhere here. Yeah. And we had another competition with the area around the Friedrichstraße, and it was won by a Berliner architect, Nahlbach, and his idea was bring the old structure back to the city, and this high house from German architect from DDR time will be integrated in the historical structure, and we have a lot of private projects, block per block, with different investors and different architects. So we go down from the north to the south. Next corner is the intersection Straße Linden, Friedrichstraße, a very famous corner. That's the actual situation. That's not the actual situation, it's a picture from 1 year old. Next, please. This was the historical situation, the very famous hotels and restaurants in this corner. A very, very small street, 12 meters wide street. It's the oldest part of the Friedrichstadt, a so-called Dorotheenstadt, and we bring back the historical scale with modern architect. That is the result of a first prize of a competition as a hotel, a new hotel from Steinebach and Weber in Berlin. The other side, on the Straße unter den Linden, this is very actual, this photo. It's 1 week old. It's a typical building from the DDR period. It goes back from the street corner, the historical street corner is somewhere here. And it's a modern building from the DDR time, so-called Linden Corso. And this was in competition too, and it was won by an architect from Frankfurt, mine, Christoph Meckler. And we just discussed about the architecture in these typical elements. So we go down to the next block. It's a so-called Hofgarten project. This is the direction of the Friedrichstraße. This is the Behrenstraße. These are the historical rests within one block. It was bought from an American investor, and there was a competition, and it was won from Paul Josef Kleihues out of Berlin, and with Kleihues and 4 other architects we tried to bring the block back to the city and bring the house back to the city. So, yeah, okay. So you see some different houses in one block from different architects. Yeah, next please. The time is gone. These are the results in a model. Next please. It's on the intersection Leipziger Straße, Friedrichstraße, a project from Gerkan, so office building. So this is a very famous Checkpoint Charlie actual situation. There was a competition with an international combined investor group from America, and we had a competition with a lot of different architects. This is Philip Johnson, one house on Philip Johnson. Jetzt muss ich mal gucken, wer das hier ist. Just a moment. Das ist Gisela Glass und Kremer, Sieverts und Partner, left and right. Next please. And Lauber and Wörr from Munich, and SOM from New York, Chicago. So the Spittelmark, the former border, comes back to the structure with different architects. So a very important point of the historical structure is the Spittelmark. This is the former situation in the 20s, and that's the actual situation. Next, please. So we'll bring back the historical structure with new buildings. Next, please. And this is the new building within the old structure with new architecture. That's a project from an office from Düsseldorf and Köln. This is the Leipziger Straße, a very small street in the Friedrichstraße, and we had a competition. The first prize was won by Hans Kolloff, and his proposal is to bring back the historical structure to the city, and we will build a smaller building in front of the DDR houses. Next, please. This is the Potsdamer Platz on Leipziger Platz, historical situation in the 20s, actual situation. This was the Potsdamer Platz competition 2 years ago with different architects from all over the world. On the left side, this is also Stürmer from London, Hamburg, and this is Hans Koller from Berlin with a proposal with very high houses. But we decided to bring it back to the historical structure of Berlin. Therefore, the first prize go to Hilmer and Sattler from Munich. I think you have heard about this very famous competition. To see what is the scale, this is the Philharmonic from Hans Scharoun, this is the National Gallery from Mies van der Rohe, this is the Bibliothek from Scharoun too. Yeah. Next, please. In the meantime, we have a different competition to bring this project in concrete with different uses, and this is the first prize from the Daimler-Benz competition. First prize from Rezzo Piano from Genua and Paris, and this is Helmut Jahn from Chicago for the Sony section from the Potsdamer Platz area. Next, please. This is a special service for you. The whole time I am talking about private investment, but we have another problem. This area near the Potsdamer Platz, in the so-called Albrecht Straße, is a place of the former SS headquarters, and we had a competition to build a museum in this area, and this is a museum from an architect from Switzerland. Zumthor is his name. It's a very strange building within a strange atmosphere. This was the former area from the SS headquarters, totally destroyed from the bombs, and after the Second World War it was a test area for car driving, and so it's held in this situation. So actually we built a new museum in this form. Next, please. An outlook to an actual situation in Berlin, back to the north side from the historical city, the Alexanderplatz. It's a very famous place from the DDR time. Here is the place where the DDR tried to show what is a modern city in the thinking of a socialist planner with the hotel project. This is the actual situation. And we just discussed the first step of a big competition from we organized 2 months ago. This is one of the works we are discussing now as alternatives. This is Hans Koloff from, this is Ingenhofen from Köln. Das ist Daniel Liebeskind aus Berlin. Next, please. And this is Knie und Weber, an architect office from East Berlin, and this is Hans Koller. So you see, we have all the time the same problem to bring old structure together with new investments and new architecture, and we discuss it just at the Alexanderplatz. Next, please. That's it. Thank you.
And there is, for those people who wanted some note of the as I said, we will probably come back to some of those images again, and whilst I think whilst the slides have been put up, no, they are already. Can I introduce Alan Balfour? For those people who live and work in the AA, there's obviously no need to introduce him, but he's the director of the Architectural Association, and he's going to talk about London and Berlin. London is a place that he's coming to terms with, I think. Berlin, I think he knows extremely well and has spent a lot of his life in the States. And I think this is an overview from a partial outsider, perhaps, of both cities. And again, would set the stage. We're running a little bit late, but I think that'll be all right. We'll catch up during the discussion period.
We'll have the slides when you I know I've got the control. I can never remember. What I'm going to give is a historical perspective, and I'll make some editorial comments along the way. What I thought would be useful very much in complementing what this extraordinary activity now going on in the city is to reflect on the idea of city in the last 200 years and how it's played out and how we inherited. What I worry about in Berlin is what we see as architecture. We don't see city. I have been recently involved in the Alexandra Pass competition, and I have agonized for the last 4 or 5 years over the Potsdamer Platz site, and it's that I'll use as the sort of seam with which we can look at the imagination, the shifting imagination of European culture over the last 200 years. I love the idea of this drawing. I mean, this is from somewhere around 1730. Dutch engineers come to Berlin and they mark on marshland these figures, idealized figures. They stand back and they conceptualize the ideas. And slowly it fills in. Slowly along these simple pegs on the ground, buildings follow, and a social performance is laid out. The octagon you see was the great entry to the city from the favorite palace of Frederick the Great, Sans Souci. He would ride in through these gates. Although there's no evidence, there's a sense that in making it the octagon, he was being envious of the Place Louis le Grand, the Place Mansard Palace. It was always that envy that Berlin had for certainly Paris, but provinces of Europe. This is a provincial city, an extremely autocratic city with immense power. And as figures are marked on the ground, I need to have my hand held in doing these things, I must say. As figures are marked on the ground, so architects follow and they dress up the idea of city. This is the most extraordinary piece of the 18th century imagination. This is the architect Frederick Schiele. In 1793, conceiving of a monument to the great hero of Russia, and conceiving it against the rules of the competition, a site that seems to be continuing in competition, against the rules of conceiving it, this great palace sitting in the middle of the octagon. The way in which, once we lay out the play, architecture gathers round the play. The play itself is going to be right. I approach this hesitantly. There we are. And this is an extraordinary play. Again, it's much clearer in Berlin than it is in London. I'll come to London. Well, there you have them both. There you have Elizabethan London around 1600. And here we have Berlin in 1733. And just, I think it's important, one little sort of reference, a key as we go through this. Here is the octagon. And London is hard to compare, but in all that we wrestle with now, these traces of history continue to kind of interfere. This is the archetypal European city, and I will generalize grandly and maybe not always accurately, but it is shaped in the 13th century, as it celebrated its 750th anniversary very recently, around the power of the church and the castle. Oh, that's very good. The castle and the church, they're both there. Extremely autocratic. The city is a unique instrument, but at war with in a sense, the countryside. It is an instrument, a social instrument separate from the country. This idea for me of the burgher being absolutely distinct from the peasant is very important in following through some political history of ways it develops. Slowly there's the rise of at first, as I see this, and I romanticize about these figures, there's the rise of the autocratic prince, increasingly about the 15th, 16th century, feeling secure in his own authority against the church, feeling secure enough to begin to mark the land in an idealized way. And first of all, you have the sort of idealized figure within the dense medieval tissue of the city, and then by the 1660s, there's a sense that you can actually map, you can actually project the future in the structure of the city. And it's interesting. I mean, throughout Europe, there are no local engineers. No one is trained to do this. And in Berlin, in this case, Dutch engineers are called in, and they lay out in the 1680s this section, almost with military order, against a wall that runs on this line here. They idealize essentially a totally neutral grid on the land, but not with any notion of democracy, wholly around the idea of reason. And within these grids, the aristocracy, who are in a sense part of or captive by the feudal court, begin to occupy these spaces. This was a tissue very much designed by aristocracy. These were streets of townhouses behind which the peasants or the urban workers and the industries would grow. This shift from 1680 to 1730 is interesting, and it seemed to me to be interesting again in terms of the increasing confidence in the way we speculate about the idea of city. From essentially a neutral pattern on the ground that arises at the notion that the city can embody metaphysical ideas. It can be more than merely reason. It can actually imply content. And in this extension, these three great gates to the city are built: the Brandenburg Tor, the Leipziger Tor, and the Hallisches Tor. Each, in some modest way perhaps, reflecting the city's relationship to the new sites, each marked in terms of ideal figure. But along with the metaphysics, there's a very complex sort of double game going on. There are also places where there can be much more control of the movement of peasants and the movement of trade. Between 1680 and 1730, the tensions that had persisted for 600 years, that led to successions of wars, had eased, and by 1730 the issue was not defense against threats of attack, but security of the economy. Walls around the cities of the 18th century are tax walls. There's an absolute distinction with those who are allowed to live in here and those who live out here. And you continually control the flow of goods and people at each of these points. London, again, this is one sense. We need a perfect diagram of tensions. London, on the other hand, is a much more complicated figure. 1600, again, you can see this is 1600, never under enormous threat. Actually, still, even in 1600, living within their own walls in the Carden Documents, slowly easing out. Essentially, what you see present was a political situation in which no one had the authority to impose order on the land. This is the product of autocracy. This is a product of that continual compromise that shaped London with the Roman conquest. I remember walking with Nicholas Taylor, and you probably all done this. I have no authority in London, by the way, but it intrigues me the degree to which history continually becomes a burden. You can walk around the 13 estates between Westminster and the Tower of London still. You can find trip overs, in the back of the Savoy, pieces of medieval structure. Not only the order, as we see, but also the possession, preventing London idealizing itself. These are essentially contemporaneous, and you see very clearly, this is 1807, I think, and there you see this explosion of reason out of the kind of trap of the medieval order. And here you see a city endlessly compromised, but not terribly unhappy with that, it seems. Marked by the Tower, marked by Westminster, marked by St. Paul's. I can't quite find St. Paul's. Marked still by Roman roads, marked by a process of endless compromise. And even when there are, as with here, the sense and the promise of reasonable development, these aristocratic developments, never as perfected as here or as in Edinburgh for that matter. Edinburgh is an interesting third element for me in this, because unlike all the other models, this confused model, this autocratic model, Edinburgh is the democratic model. I come from Edinburgh. This is 1835, and I like this very much. The city still absolutely constrained, in part by its medievalism. The growth of industry begins to be found always on the east, always in the line of prevailing winds, always again exactly with London, by and large. But by 1830, it's still essentially holding these two characters: medieval tissue, the idealized tissue, and then, as with London, comes the rail, comes this absolute collapse of the legal presence of the burden, comes astonishing influx of population. I'm going to do, let me just go back to this. Forgive me, I'm not, there we are. And in the case of Berlin, it's interesting that the rail comes right into the center of, along the edge of Potsdamer Platz, in front of Schenkel's gates to the Leipzig, to the octagon that we've seen. Once you create these figures, they tend to actually control the performance of the city for centuries to come. And this seemed to be interesting. At this point, there is the emergence of a really new city, a city we're very familiar with, in which, in a sense, the railroad and the tram cars, the dramatic increase in population, the complex introduction of industry, simply prevents any notion of idealizing the city. The city becomes an instrument, much more than idealized figure. It's interesting that even when London tries to idealize, in contrast to South Friedrichstadt, which is what we've just seen, it has to work between all of the compromises, all of the ownerships, all of the essentially inherited feudal authority that still shapes the city. You know that when we want to do things here, or when issues come up in terms of the square, we receive guidance from the markets of Tavistock. Bedford and Stanley constructed this square in the 1790s. This is exactly a problem of these forces. And Somerset has an extraordinary sketch map of the West London estates in the 1830s, the way in which these are all essentially extensions of that feudal possession that is established between Westminster and the Tower in the 13th century, in the 12th century. Now, although there's similarity as Berlin, since the 1860s, begins to expand dramatically and begins to position itself industrially, there is similarities in the grain. What changes them seems to be the nature of it. This is the new rich. There's a certain amount of aristocratic money, but it's the new rich. It's speculation. It's highly confused in disorders. This is old money, still all old money, and it only goes where there's interest. The disinterest in those pieces of London that sat outside of I will go back if I can on this side. Of those pieces that sit outside. This is a map from from 1890 of all the major. It's a very poor map for you to see, but it's one that we're daily faced with, but we fail to realize that these are all controlled by essentially the interests of families and of invented wealth. This shape is I'm no authority in London, but it does interest me that in exactly the same way as Berlin packs its burgeoning industrial population, more and more of the gap between the order of the city. London essentially has an area on the east of enormous confusion in which without the authority of those that inherited wealth, you get fast into slum. This is a slum report. This is London poverty reported in 1889. And out of that, of course, comes the idealizing of the socialist project, the idea of public housing. But as I say, you know a great deal more of that than I. And London, since the war, is something that you're authority on. This is always the image of London I'm left with. In terms of the idea of city, London is an idea that still seems to me a smudge, a block, a figure of such complexity and such disordered tissue we don't know how to speculate or idealize about it. Berlin has however, remained a figure, a setting for speculation and idealizing at least. And let me just hold the map of Berlin from this, in this case, 1930. It is too indistinct in this light for you to see. In a sense, the piece we looked at, here's the medieval piece, here is the idealized piece, here is this point that has interested me all these years, the way in which this octagon marked in the land in 1730s plays out over time, and I'll take you through its fate since the 1930s. And again, through it all, what interests me is the wish to share thoughts on the idea of city to the body, not architecture, but the idea of city. Mendelssohn's an ambiguous figure, but there's no doubt he enjoyed the generous idea of city as a thing that rejects history, as an extremely leanly wrought piece of modern instrument, machine. And he takes the figure of the 1730s and he sees it being at the center of this seamless, stripped, ahistorical tissue, endlessly able to change. For Mendelssohn, as he was buried into a building on Potsdamer Platz, Columbus House. The building, in fact, and it's one of the most poignant drawings of this period. The building, in fact, hangs like a teardrop. It was constructed on the north wall of Albert Speer's building for Goring. But here again is the octagon. Essentially, the order of the 18th century is maintained on this line, the tax wall line. The order of the 19th century, the instrumental city, is maintained. And this then, in Hitler's mind, would be a totally new order. It was the most dramatic playing out of that wish for Berlin to assume its appropriate status as the center of the Holy Roman Emperor. It will be the city for all time, a city of infinite power and permanence. This little octagon sits right in here. The great axe sits between Grosshalle, the great hall of the nation, 1,000 feet high, built for eternity. And the monument that would mark all of those whose lives had to be sacrificed to bring it. 4 miles long, designed to command the attention of the world. So the city, here is the ultimate. And in Hitler's writing, he made this city in the right way, with the right order, in a sense cleanse the world, create a new morality, a new confidence. Here's a city in its ultimate and most monstrous project, it seems to me. And of course, this project collapses completely. And it's terribly important looking at all of these plans that Rachel showed us, to realize that the occupation was absolute occupation, as you know. You had to take a French aircraft or an American aircraft or a British aircraft to fly to the city, or a Russian aircraft. It was all manned by the crews, and it was, this was a city of occupation for 40 years. The piece we've looked at is right there, right at the hub of it. And it's not only the division of realities, but really clearly Russia initially, and then by the late 60s, the sort of the revival of East Germany's role in as the fathers of modernism gave way, the Stalin's project gave way. This was a reality shaped absolutely in contradiction to these realities. Not enough in small ways, these were realities, in this case, shaped in the American vision, in the British vision, the French vision. These were administrations that actually shifted. The type of schools, the local administrations, clinics. I really should have shown you the tourism map first. But through this period, and this is the most telling of sites we've just seen illustrations of, through this period, through these 40 years, there was an extraordinary struggle going on. For a very long time, ignored on the east. This, here we have that optimism that we began with. This was the tax wall. This became the line of the Berlin Wall. A curious anomaly that this actually was the boundary, but it obviously was more work than was appropriate, so the wall just moved across there. This became a non-place. I watched over the years a return to London, strange beasts and lurk in the thick in the middle of this great city. This was the whole city. But what is the story about this map? From the very first, the West Berlin Senate retained every mark, every property line, every building line from the city of 1939. This is Hitler's Reichskanzler. This is the great Wertheim department store. Nothing existed. This was the site of Columbus House. There are thousands of legal struggles now, struggling with every piece of these properties, underlying these projects. No, 5 minutes. Another kind of fiction on the other side that intrigues me. The West, this curious, isolated place, struggles to find how do you create a center of meaning? How do you create some significance? A place where there's no place.
Very important that the Sharon Philharmonie plays exactly on the old Potsdamer Street.
That's right, yes. But of course the plans were also going to build a great highway along here, which is why that building assumes that. The Sharon building is for me the most significant building of post-war. I mean, it's still in every way conceived, and we struggle about issues of historicism, issues of deconstruction. This is the ultimate object of power communication. How can I say something when there's nothing to say? I will make an object totally unto itself. Brilliant building, absolutely brilliant. This is much more difficult, but equally brilliant. This is truly the symbol of New Berlin. And the symbol is promised. The extraordinary thing in terms of these competitions is no one knows how to build next to it. We don't know what to do. It's the most unforgiving building. In terms of metaphysical power, nothing is more extraordinary. I do love this, I mean, it seems to me if there are clues to the future, here is the 18th century mind, there's no doubt. If there are clues to the future that we should look to, we find it in these two things. It was Piano's ability to actually make the edge between this development we just saw and this building that very well in the competition. I have very quickly. The tourist maps of the 1980s ignored completely the fact that this was wasteland. Even the Potsdamer, I guess, it says that the Potsdamer U-Bahn is still there. This is a complete wasteland. And of course, within this, there are all the places. Here, Hitler, body is burned. Here are SS tunnels beneath the ground. There's a monstrous history where you know it was smooth. But even more extraordinary, of course, is the other side, in which there is no reality outside the wall. The edge of East Berlin was the edge of the world. I thought it was, I mean, my concern is in all of the activity, and I admire the architects we've seen very much indeed, but at the center, at this time, is the loss of the idea of city. And I understand why this was the scheme that was chosen. Hillman's Atlas scheme for the redevelopment. This is the Sony site. Here is where Piano's building will build. This was simply a master plan. But even in the things that followed, I think this seems the most uncertain retreat to essentially a figural 18th century view. We do not know how to be figural city at this time, since we know it's this. We are making wonderful things for the idea of cities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Next on our list we have Rob Scott, and I'm very interested because what Alan was discussing about the city and the idea of city, the idea of a tissue of disorder and the idea of the city as an expression of the new morality, we in London are now looking at the East Thames Corridor, that whole raft which is the east of London, the old slum area, the old industrial area, as an area for expansion for the city. Will it be an expression of the 1990s morality, a morality which perhaps is non-interventionist, and with it will happen the loss of the idea of city? Perhaps Rob will take up some of those themes, and we can expand on those themes in some of the discussions that we have later. Rob Scott from London.
Well, Alan certainly dished me up a hard act to follow. I was listening to him, and quite frankly, ideas like the East Thames Corridor as a figure within which we can idealize, or for the expression of metaphysical ideas, well, oh dear. The only parallel I could really find was with the idea that the edge of East Berlin amounts to the edge of the world. Now that I really can relate to. However, we mustn't think that way, because that's precisely why, arguably, the East Thames Corridor is in the mess that it's in today. I've been given 20 minutes to talk about one of the most complicated planning jobs this country's ever undertaken, really. And I can't really do that. I've got to leave out some very important aspects. And I'm instead just going to concentrate on three things. I'm going to talk about where it is, what it is, and what we're doing about it. So where is it? Let's see if we can make this thing work. No. No. Once more, please. It's the easiest thing to swap it over to the other projector, which does seem to be working. Well, we'll find out, won't we? This is where it is. I mean, it's very important to get the idea of the scale of it. We're talking about an utterly different scale from the little bit of Berlin we were hearing about earlier today. This area is 50 miles from end to end. This is London Docklands at the western end. We stretch out beyond the M25, which really marks the edge of the conurbation. That's London's orbital motorway. We keep going past the Medway towns here, right out into a fairly rural Kent. And we take in also the very important container port of Tilbury, that's London's most busy port, and the car port of GNS. So it's an utterly different scale from anything we've heard about earlier today. It's also, as we began to hear from Alan, the unfashionable side of London. It always has been. There are historical reasons for that I don't have time to go into. They're quite complicated. But it's always been the unfashionable side. Development has always wanted to locate towards the west of the region. That's never been a stronger trend than it has in the last, say, 20 years, when the influence of Heathrow has really begun to bear. And the east has been left to become the home of big, dirty industry, power generation, waste disposal, and all the sorts of things that the people that live over the west don't like to see on their doorstep. It's London's backyard. So it seems perverse, really, that we've chosen this, we've made such an unnatural choice for our strategic growth area. But there are two quite important reasons why we've done that. One is the overheating of the west. The west part of the region really has run out of space. We are developing in increasingly attractive bits of countryside, and we're putting ever greater pressures on the road and rail systems of the west of the region. So a question is being asked, can't some of this be pushed across to the east side of the region? That's the first point. The second point that really has focused attention very firmly is the decision by government 2 years ago to take an easterly approach of the high-speed rail link, that's the new rail link which will connect us with mainland Europe, so that it comes through Essex and East London and right through the East Thames Corridor. And the two reasons that that route was chosen were firstly for its better environmental performance and secondly for its regeneration potential. So those two factors together have really strongly focused attention on the east rather than the west of the region. So that's where it is. What is it? Well, one of the things the East Thames Corridor is a huge reservoir of development potential. We reckon there's at least 4,000 hectares of land available here. That's just in the short to medium term. In the long term, you could possibly double that. And this map shows where the main sites are. You can see that they're stretched out on both banks of the river. Or you could see that if you could see the river, which winds its way through there like that. So that's the first thing it is, a huge reservoir of opportunity. The second thing it is actually an opportunity to take for the first time a planned approach to the development and environmental improvement of an area this big, planning on the grand scale, which is not a thing we do in this country. But it's not just the volume of land that's important, there's also the sheer variety of types of site. And I really don't have time to go through them all, but I can just give you a flavour. This is Stratford. Stratford's in East London. It's a fairly important town centre in the inner city. There's about 60 hectares of land here that's old railway land for the most part. Stratford's very well connected already, and there are two rail schemes in the planning stages. One is the extension of the Jubilee line, which is one of our tube lines. Another one, more important, is the connection of the commuter lines that come in from the east into London with those which come in from the west, so that you have a continuous rail connection right the way through London. That's called Crossrail. Both of those will come to Stratford, and that will make Stratford the second best connected site in the whole of London, second only to King's Cross. That's Stratford. Near to Stratford is the Royal Docks. This is the one remaining part of London Docklands that hasn't been developed yet. I mean, you can see for yourself a stunningly attractive waterfront location. I think one of the very best regeneration sites in Europe, capable of attracting the best architecture in the world, no question about that at all. It's already got its infrastructure in. The Docklands Light Railway has been extended out here, and in fact 2 days ago, the Limehouse link was opened, which would give us better road access into the area too. So it's got all its railways, all its roads, and it's even had all its trees planted. All it lacks is development. If we go out a bit further east, downstream, we come across big sites that are slightly different in character from the two you've seen. They're a bit softer, a bit greener. This is Barking Reach. It's 250 hectares, and it's got this wonderful soft river edge, a very rare thing in London. You go out another few miles and you come to Rainham Marshes, exactly the same character. Huge sites. You could build something like 6,000 houses on this site. If we continue eastwards, we come to the point where the M25 is taken over the river on this new bridge. And down here at Dartford, there's a whole constellation of development opportunities. We think there's something like 800 hectares of land in and around Dartford. I mean, that's really enough to start to think in terms of building a new piece of waterfront city. And that's exactly what, in the report which we prepared, which I'll tell you about later, we suggested should be done in this location. The sorts of sites that you have here include vast tracts of riverfront, right under the bridge, in symbolically important locations as well as functionally important ones. Two of the sites that I've just mentioned are candidates for international passenger stations as well on the fast link that's being planned at this moment. So all that begs the question, why is nothing happening? Why hasn't the development world taken up this wonderful opportunity? Well, there are firstly some sort of boring physical planning reasons. Why? Why not? A lot of the land is contaminated or otherwise affected by past uses. A lot of it's old industrial land. And so it would require a lot of money, mostly money up front, to prepare it for development. Some of the sites, not all, but some of them, also have to be improved in terms of their transport connections. I think that's a rather overstated problem in the main, but nevertheless, in some areas it is important. But I think there's a bigger reason, and it's to do with perceptions. I think that the real reason that development hasn't happened is to do with prevailing attitudes towards the East Thames Corridor. And what we have is a self-perpetuating cycle, a self-destructive cycle, where, because of the poor environment, expectations about what can and can't be done in the East Thames Corridor are severely depressed. The sorts of things that you wouldn't think twice about doing in the west of London, like burying overhead cables or fixing up sites, are treated in the east with derision. So you have a low expectation, that leads to mediocre development, sites not fulfilling their potential, and that in turn fuels the already poor environmental conditions of the corridor. So that's a cycle that we've really got to attack if the East Thames Corridor is to fulfil its potential. If that's its potential, that's what's currently being done with it. I think that demonstrates the scale of the problem. So what are we doing about the East Thames Corridor? One thing we've already done, in fact my company has already done, is to do a study of the development potential for the Department of the Environment. That's the government department responsible for planning in this country, to the extent that any government department is. It wasn't a plan. We were simply asked to look at the capacity of the land for development and to identify some of the reasons why development isn't coming forward, and to identify the different directions which development could possibly take. We concluded from that study that the East Thames Corridor does indeed have vast potential, but that it will never be realised without a coordinating strategy, something to generate a common sense of purpose and direction, to generate some confidence in the area, and to harness the combined power of the public and private sectors, so that instead of pulling against each other, they're pulling together. And that really raises a fundamental problem for us. I have to digress now into sort of a treatise on the administrative machinery. We don't actually have in this country the necessary administrative machinery to carry out such a strategy. We don't have the experience either. For one thing, there's no strategic authority for London. There's no one body which takes responsibility for the whole of London, for its future shape, for the direction, broad direction that development should take. That power is vested in 32 local authorities, and the only coordination that there is between them is what scant advice is offered by central government. Even if there was, though, more than a half of the East Thames Corridor is outside of London. It's in Essex, the counties of Essex and Kent. So the preparation of a strategy would require one of three things. Either the coordination of the efforts of 17 local authorities, or the invention of a new planning authority for the East Thames Corridor, or a special initiative by the government do it themselves. And that's what the government have decided to do. They've set up a task force, and they've charged that task force with the responsibility to carry out, by the end of this year, a strategy for the development and environmental improvement of the East Thames Corridor. And I think that's quite an interesting parallel, really, or contrast with Berlin. Because we were hearing earlier how Berlin is faced with these new problems following of organisation and administration, following reunification and the liberalisation of the market. And you're having to face up to the fact that you lack the planning framework to sort of take on this task of urban reconstruction and to handle the private sector interest. Here we are in the UK with a century of town planning behind us, and supposedly one of the most sophisticated planning machineries in the world, are actually no better organised to cope with a problem on this scale than you are in Berlin. So back to the script. The government's doing a strategy. What could this strategy say? What sort of things could it contain? I'll just mention 4 of the ideas that we floated in the Llewellyn-Davies report. It's not by any means the sum total of what the strategy could contain, but it's 4 things that we think are important. The first thing to say is that the western end of the East Thames Corridor, the inner end, the London end, has to be more firmly anchored than it is today. Big problem is that East London is simply not seen as either part of the commercial core or the cultural core of London. And it has to be seen that way, because otherwise the East Thames Corridor will never break out of the role that people ascribe to it today. We think there is a way to donate, if you like, a new role to East London. And we think it's the role of East London, the European destination. The Stratford International Station will provide the means by which millions of European business and other visitors could reach East London every year. The motive for them to do so is the eastwards expanding city through the Docklands axis. There is more reason for people to come to East London than there's ever been before. And the Royal Docks, that wonderful opportunity for truly world-class development, provides us the opportunity to put there the things that the European visitor might want to see. So we think there's a great synergy between those three bits of the western end of the corridor, and a strategy could articulate a means by which the East London breaks out of its current negative role and finds a new one. And there it is. That's the first thing, anchoring the eastern end of the corridor. We then, though, have to counterbalance the London influence. We can't have a situation where the East Thames Corridor is simply seen as the gradual outwards extension of Docklands. That would leave North Kent waiting for years and years and years for its regeneration. And regeneration in North Kent is terribly much needed. There's all sorts of environmental damage now here at Dartford. This suffers from the legacy of years of chalk extraction. There's huge holes in the ground all over that area. Out here in the Medway towns, very shaky economy because of the closure of the naval dockyards. So North Kent needs to be anchored into the strategy very firmly and very quickly. So we're proposing that what we should have is a counter-magnet here in the Dartford area on the scale of a new waterfront city on the M25 at that symbolic point where the M25, the river and the Channel Tunnel Railway all intersect. And there that is. The third thing we have to do is to provide an environmental framework for the East Thames Corridor. And we think that in that, a strategic landscape plan is a tremendously important facet. This would build on the positive elements of the East Thames Corridor, particularly the river, opening it to the public, locating mixed-use centres on it, landscaping it, developing its use for transport, creating a riverside walk on it. It would secondly contain some of the visual problems and eyesores of the corridor, and it would thirdly create a framework within which the new developments could sit. So that's the third thing. We've got anchoring the London end, we've got the counterbalance at the other end, we've got the landscape framework. And I think the fourth thing that we have to explore when we're preparing this strategy is the scope for sustainable development. Great thing about the East Thames Corridor is it is actually big enough to make a difference. We can actually experiment with forms of development in the East Thames Corridor that would be less wasteful of resources. And two particular things that we could do is firstly experiment with different ways of organising our employment and commercial centres to break down traditional patterns of commuting, which are very strongly tidal at the moment, into central London every morning, out again every evening. We experimented with comparing dispersed or concentrated forms of employment, and the results are very interesting. And the other thing that we can do is to recycle urban wasteland, areas of London that have been used for industry and for other contaminated uses before. There's an enormous potential in the East Thames Corridor to provide land for housing for up to 120,000 houses, in fact, without making any inroads at all into the green belt or into virgin green land. So those are a couple of ideas to develop ideas of sustainability on a scale that would actually make some impact. Those then are some of the ideas that we've put forward to the government for a strategy for the East Thames Corridor, and now we have to wait to see whether they can actually plan with the kind of imagination which I think, and we, Llewellyn Davies, think, that the East Thames Corridor truly deserves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob Scott. We're just about on time. Would anybody like to? Alan, before you go, I think it might be worth just having 5 minutes or so of questions before we all disappear for coffee, and then try and come back a little bit earlier for the discussion on transportation and urban design. Would anybody like to ask some questions? Hans, would you like to ask any questions of Rob or of Alan? Are there any things that you're... No? Yes? Yes, Martin.
I've got one question particularly to Dr. Stimmann's talk. I love 18th and 19th century cities. But what's slightly better, what slightly puzzles me is that the 100 years of planning theory was passed by without without a murmur. I mean, perhaps you were deliberately only talking about building as such, but I mean, there have been theories with which I don't necessarily agree. One can think about new transport, greater amounts of space, what one does with housing, perhaps whether if one is expanding Berlin, making new towns on the outside or making new things on the periphery, and you were simply forgetting or not mentioning all these concepts that people have been involved in reactive and reconstructing, and going back to these proposals which originated in through the book by Alan, these nice Dutch plans of the 17th century and sort of speculative housing put up in the 19th century. I wonder sort of why, without explanation, you're going back to this, which may be the best answer, but why you're just partly going back to reconstruct the 19th century city.
Yeah, I tried to explain it to you with my words and my pictures, but I feel I was not very successful. The situation in Berlin is very extraordinary in relationship to every city all around the world. The city was destroyed, not from the bombs like other cities in the world. The city was an experience field for planning from the planners in the West Hemisphere and the East Bloc. The people from and they came from all over the world after the Second World War. The Germans feel that we don't like our history, and so because the history was part of the history of the Nazis, and so the people, our fathers, make a very radical cut, and they look forward to a new future, like the working class people in the 19th century. And they dream from an unknown future, and the future that the West people took it over from America. Was Mr. Sharoon, for instance. He was dreaming from an open landscape, with motorways and big blocks and houses and very happy people. So, and he took these ideas from new planning within a historical city. If you have to take these ideas to London, overtake it to London, whereas your old city, some comes and says everything is, we have a totally new idea. 800 It's not only the 19th century, it's the century of the 18th and the 17th. It's 750 years Berliner history, and it's a Baroque city. So this was a Western planet, and the Eastern planet too. They had an idea from the East Bloc cities like Moscow or Warsaw, big streets and against this typical 19th century area, and they broke it all down. So Berlin in the inner city, not outside the city. Berlin in the center of the city was a field of experiences from planners and from politics too. So and the result was it totally destroyed city. So the Berliners themselves, and it was cut in two parts: East Berlin, West Berlin. And so the Berliners themselves, they lost their own history. Every 5 days in my office, I talk to the Berliners like a teacher in the ground in the basic school. So I have the Berliners. You had an old city. Nobody from the Berliners know where is the Potsdamer Platz, where the Leipziger Platz, where was the historical center. It's nothing lost. Even this only some very important point, and it's mostly the people from outside. They know where's the historical city. So it's an absolutely extraordinary situation in Berlin, and we feel that we shall stop destroying. And so we try to help the rest of the historical structure, and we try to help the rest of these old buildings and fill it up with new buildings. That's the reason why we do this in this special way. And indeed we have a big discussion in Berlin about traffic. All these the members of the Conservative Party in the government. We have a coalition in the government in Berlin. They ask me, what about the cars? You fill it up with 2.5 million square meters office. All these people try to go with a car within the city. And I answer, yeah, they have to go take the tube or the S-Bahn or the railway or the bicycle. So if Berlin was not destroyed, the question was nobody would ask such a question. It's a typical question from new Berliners. They all the time they try to transform this old city in a new city with this very wide street. Especially, I showed you this picture from the Leipziger Straße. It was from a very typical Baroque street. It was Baroque houses, 22 meter scale and 3 floors high, and the DDR people thought they have to transform it in a motorway. It was 4 lines or 6 lines in each direction. So we stopped destroying in the inner city.